It began on an ordinary Tuesday when my husband Nathan was summoned to an unplanned afternoon session with his supervisor. I had driven to his workplace to hand over some contracts he had accidentally left on the kitchen counter that morning. Usually I would simply leave such things with the receptionist and be on my way. But something pulled me toward the elevator that day, a manila envelope clutched against my chest. When the doors opened on the 4th floor, I noticed the conference room where Nathan was supposed to be meeting stood completely vacant. Only one person occupied the space nearby, Mr. Wallace, Nathan's senior director. I paused at the threshold, uncertain whether to make my presence known or quietly retreat the way I came. Before I could make a decision, he glanced up from the scattered reports covering his sleek oak desk and offered a genuine smile. There was something settling about his expression, a quiet assurance that eased the sudden discomfort I felt standing there uninvited. "You must be Emma," he said. "Nathan speaks of you quite often. Please come inside. No need to hover in the hallway." I stepped forward, my shoes tapping gently against the hardwood, the scent of freshly brewed espresso and worn leather filling my senses. His workspace was elegantly arranged, shelves heavy with vintage volumes, a handful of framed countryside paintings that suggested tranquility rather than corporate coldness. Golden afternoon light poured through the wide window, illuminating tiny specks of dust drifting lazily through the air. "I appreciate that," I replied, sensing the sincerity of his welcome and noticing a subtle inquisitiveness in the way he tilted his head. I placed the envelope on the edge of his desk and found myself lingering longer than intended. I couldn't explain it, but the usual barriers I maintained with strangers seemed to dissolve in that space. We started with small talk at first. He inquired about Nathan, about my career, about everyday life. But as our exchange deepened, I sensed he wasn't simply being courteous. There was an authentic interest behind his questions, a genuine desire to understand me as an individual, rather than merely his employee's wife. I felt acknowledged in a way that rarely happened, even among close friends. Somewhere between our discussion about neighborhood restaurants and his thoughtful observations on balancing professional and personal priorities, the room seemed to contract. The walls drew closer, the atmosphere growing heavier and more personal. I caught myself laughing at something he mentioned, and for one fleeting instant, the exhaustion of the day, the errands, the gridlock, the endless balancing act, simply melted away. I departed that office later, the envelope still in my grasp, my thoughts refusing to abandon the conversation we had shared. Nothing inappropriate had occurred, yet the emotional resonance I experienced remained, leaving me both uneasy and curiously energized. It was unforeseen, entirely respectful, and profoundly touching. As I stepped into the elevator to leave, a small realization washed over me. Sometimes life introduces you to someone who reminds you that even within the most mundane circumstances, there exists an opportunity to feel genuinely understood. I couldn't release that afternoon from my thoughts. Despite it being merely a brief exchange, something about the composed certainty of his presence stayed with me. The following morning, I found myself hesitating beside the kitchen counter, mentally replaying pieces of our dialogue like a cherished melody. It was peculiar. I barely knew him, yet it felt as though a hidden door had quietly swung open within a part of me I hadn't realized was waiting. Several days later, I returned to that building, though under far more routine circumstances. Nathan had departed suddenly for a business conference, and I had volunteered to deliver certain documents directly to Mr. Wallace. Walking through the lobby entrance, my heartbeat accelerated in a manner that felt both recognizable and foreign. The elevator journey seemed extended beyond normal. Perhaps it was merely my imagination. When I entered his workspace, he looked up and smiled as though he had been anticipating my arrival. "Emma," he spoke, his tone welcoming yet measured. "I didn't expect to see you again quite so soon." I laughed nervously, observing how sunlight reflected off the crystal awards displayed on his shelves, creating patterns that seemed almost purposeful, as if the room itself wanted to make the occasion memorable. We began conversing again, this time with a cadence that felt nearly instinctive, like resuming a discussion interrupted mid-thought. He asked about Nathan's current assignments, but gradually we wandered toward more personal territories, family histories, childhood recollections, the small experiences that mold who we become. There was no discomfort, no urgency, only the patient revealing of stories between us. I remember pausing to survey the office. The leather armchair where I had settled previously seemed somehow gentler, the light filtering through the blinds warmer. A stillness existed that transformed even minor gestures, passing a pen, straightening a page, offering a seat, into something meaningful. Every movement, every glance carried significance that wasn't romantic in any traditional manner, yet was undeniably personal. At one point, he shared a memory about his deceased grandfather, a man I could envision standing dignified and quiet in a space just like this. Listening to him, I understood how uncommon it was to encounter someone who could be simultaneously commanding and gentle, authoritative yet exposed. Within that openness, I felt a bond that was disturbingly reassuring. He reclined in his chair, folding his hands over a stack of files, and momentarily the outside world seemed to vanish. "It's unusual," he said softly, "to encounter someone who truly pays attention the way you do, genuinely listens." Those words settled around me like a soft blanket, and I felt a warmth rising that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Leaving that afternoon, I experienced a peculiar blend of excitement and introspection. I hadn't violated any boundaries, yet I had uncovered something surprising about myself, a yearning for authentic human connection, for instances of honesty and comprehension that pierced through daily noise. As I stepped back into the corridor, the murmur of the office surrounding me, I understood this wasn't simply about fascination or novelty. It was about acknowledgement, discovering someone who could perceive the layers beneath the exterior, even if only momentarily. Somehow that brevity made it even more significant. Days passed, yet the echo of our discussions wouldn't fade from my consciousness. It was strange how a few simple interactions could leave such enduring impressions. I kept convincing myself it was merely appreciation, curiosity, anything to rationalize how my thoughts continually drifted back to his office, to the serene warmth of his company. Then arrived the evening Nathan needed to remain late for a client dinner, and I found myself in that building once more, this time without any formal justification. I told myself I was merely checking on some administrative matters, but deep within, I knew I was seeking that same quiet connection, that uncommon sensation of being comprehended. When I knocked gently on the door, he looked up, and briefly neither of us spoke. There was an unvoiced recognition, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that made me acutely conscious of every detail. The polished surface of his desk, the faint fragrance of coffee lingering from earlier, the soft whisper of the ventilation system. "Emma," he said, his voice steady yet carrying warmth that made my chest constrict. "You've returned." It wasn't an inquiry, more a declaration, an acknowledgement of something unspoken between us. I smiled, feeling the familiar surge of tension that was no longer uncomfortable. It was almost magnetic. We settled down, and our conversation wandered effortlessly as though the outside world had folded into this small chamber. He asked about my profession, certainly, but he also inquired about my reflections, my aspirations, the quiet hopes I seldom revealed to anyone. I found myself opening up in unexpected ways, sharing memories of my younger self, the person I had once been before existence had piled routines and obligations over her. He listened not with the casual attention reserved for guests, but with authentic focus that made me feel both appreciated and secure. A certain intensity marked the way he engaged, a subtle current in the silences and inflections of his speech. It wasn't romantic in the conventional sense, but it stirred something profound within me, a recognition of soul-level understanding that rarely occurs. At one moment, he Ned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk. "It's remarkable," he said gently, "how frequently we journey through existence without ever truly being heard. Then, unexpectedly, someone appears who changes that, even briefly." I nodded, sensing a tightness in my throat. That was precisely how I felt, though I had never managed to express it before. A tender vulnerability existed in him that made the space feel smaller, more personal. Within that closeness, I perceived a quiet reflection of my own inner landscape, a reminder of who I was beyond the identities of wife, mother, professional. I realized I wasn't merely drawn to his presence. I was rediscovering aspects of myself I had long neglected. When I finally departed, the evening sky expanding beyond the building, I felt simultaneously lighter and heavier. Lighter because I had offered pieces of my heart without fear or criticism. Heavier because I recognized this connection existed in a fragile space. Beautiful precisely because it was temporary and contained. Walking toward my vehicle, I considered what had transformed within me. Life seldom provides moments of clarity like this. Yet here was one, quiet, respectful, deeply emotional, leaving me both unsettled and profoundly thankful. I understood that sometimes growth emerges not from dramatic gestures, but from subtle, unexpected encounters that compel you to examine yourself. The days following were hushed, almost intentionally so. I continued my usual activities, running errands, preparing meals, sharing laughter with Nathan, but a gentle undercurrent flowed through everything I did, a quiet awareness of what I had discovered about myself. That connection in Mr. Wallace's office hadn't concerned betrayal or crossing lines. It had concerned recognition, being perceived and feeling vibrant in a manner I hadn't experienced in years. One afternoon, Nathan described a new initiative he was directing. The specifics were ordinary, the exchange routine, yet I caught myself smiling at the notion of entering that workspace again, of sharing modest moments that required neither drama nor danger. I recognized that my experiences had transformed me, not in obvious ways, but in subtle, meaningful ones. I was more attentive, more conscious of what genuinely mattered in dialogue, in relationships, in existence. Several weeks later, I attended a fundraising gathering where Mr. Wallace was delivering remarks. Our gazes connected across the venue, and he nodded in recognition. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't temptation. It was acknowledgement, a quiet, unspoken understanding that the moments we had shared held significance, that they had left us both slightly transformed, slightly more aware of the importance of connection and mutual respect. That evening, driving homeward, I contemplated the unexpected closeness of those afternoons. I considered how rare it was to encounter someone who could create space for you without judgment, who could listen with purpose and genuine interest, who could make the ordinary feel consequential. I understood that life overflows with these passing, meaningful encounters, ones that instruct us, awaken us, and recall the depth of human experience. Nathan was waiting at home, chuckling about some minor workplace mishap. I embraced him, experiencing an unshakable warmth in my chest. My heart was complete, not from secrecy or excitement, but from understanding that connection doesn't always require neat categories, that closeness can manifest in numerous forms, and that self-discovery often emerges from the most unlikely sources. I never discussed with Mr. Wallace how those afternoons had influenced me, and I never needed to. The moments themselves had sufficed, a quiet revelation, a gentle reminder that life can surprise you in ways that matter profoundly. I felt gratitude for the experience, for how it had reminded me to remain curious, attentive, and completely present. As I settled into my armchair with a warm cup of chamomile, I smiled at the memory of that office, the sunlight across the desk, the timbre of his voice. Existence, I realized, isn't about avoiding unexpected connections. It's about treasuring them, learning from them, and allowing them to quietly shape who we become. And within that understanding, I discovered a peace I hadn't known I was seeking.